Nancy grinned back at her boyfriend. Just testing a theory, you might say. Care to come on an errand with me?
Sure, whereabouts?
The Rennet Hotel. But I promised Bess I'd drive her home first. Ned followed the girls in his own car. Then, after going to her own house and parking in the driveway, Nancy slid in beside him. On their way to the hotel, she related the strange way in which the mystery woman, Mrs. Rose Harrod, had sent an iris to Joy Trent. I want to let her know that Joy Trent intends to get in touch with her, Nancy ended. The Rennet Hotel, though rather small and old-fashioned in its decor, was one of the most exclusive hotels in River Heights. Nancy first tried to call Mrs. Harrod's room on one of the house phones in the lobby, but no one answered, so she sought help from the desk clerk. Would you happen to know by any chance where Mrs. Harrod has gone, or how soon she'll be back?
I couldn't say, miss, but let me check her room slot.
The room clerk turned to the honeycomb of numbered cubbyholes behind the marble countertop.
Well, here's her room. Her room key's here, so she's evidently out somewhere. Let's see what this note says. He glanced at the slip of paper and pulled out of the 922 cubbyhole. That's odd, he murmured and handed it to Nancy. The paper was the kind of form slip on which clerks jotted down messages to or from the hotel guest. It said, time, 5:45 p.m. Message, if Nancy Drew or Joy Trent phone or comes to the hotel, please tell them I had to go out to the airport, but will be back shortly. Mrs. Harrod. Nancy looked up and saw the puzzled expression on the desk clerk's face. Is something wrong? I'm not sure. He scratched his head uncertainly and turned to glance up at the wall clock overhead. It's now going on 6, and I've been on duty for the past few hours. But I know I didn't write that message, so it must have been left in the slot yesterday. Nancy caught her breath anxiously. Then you mean Mrs. Harrod's been missing for the past 24 hours? Chapter 16. Kidnap Car. Well, I don't know if missing is the right word, the clerk replied cautiously, but it does seem as though she hasn't returned to the hotel. Seeing Nancy's dismayed look, he went on. Tell you what, the relief clerk, the one who must have taken down the message, will be coming on duty shortly. He can tell you more about it than I can. The desk clerk smiled reassuringly. Yes, of course, I'll wait for him, Nancy said, realizing nothing could be done until then. She went and sat next to Ned on the sofa amid the lobby's potted plants and tried to curb her impatience. Finally, after 10 long minutes, a dark-haired young man walked behind the counter, buttoning his uniform jacket. As Nancy rose and walked to the desk, she kept her fingers crossed. It turned out that she was in luck. The young man had a good memory. Sure, I remember writing down that message, he called. Mrs. Harrod dictated it to me. Some man had called her just a couple of minutes before. Did the caller leave his name? Nancy inquired. No, he had rung her room and gotten no answer, so his call was switched here to the desk. It was about that girl whose name is on the message, Joy Trent. The clerk pointed to the slip of paper on the marble counter. Do you mind telling me what the caller wanted? No. He said that if Mrs. Hereford wanted some information about this Joy Trent, she should meet him at the airport coffee shop. That he'd wait for her there exactly 1 hour, and she should look for the man with the mustache and the cane. The desk clerk went on to relate that just as he had hung up from taking the call, Mrs. Harrison herself had come walking into the lobby. I told her what the man had said, and it seemed to make her very unhappy. That when she dictated this message to me, and I stuck it in her room slot as a reminder, she turned right around and left the hotel again. Since her room key's still here, I guess she never came back. Thanks ever so much for your help. Nancy smiled at the desk clerk, trying not to show her worry. Then she went back to the sofa to tell Ned what she had learned. We'd better get to the airport, said Ned. Nancy nodded, and they hurried outside to his car. The airport was not far from River Heights, but in the rush hour traffic, and the going seemed agonizingly slow. After Ned had parked his car in the airport lot, the two young people quickly made their way to the coffee shop inside the air terminal. There was a serving counter and small tables grouped around the shop's glass window walls. Aside from a middle-aged woman nibbling a sandwich at one of the tables, the place was empty. As Nancy and Ned hesitated uncertainly, a smiling, kindly woman in a waitress uniform emerged from the kitchen. She was carrying some boxes which she put under the counter. Can I help you people? In response, Nancy described Rose Harold and the time when she had presumably come to the coffee shop yesterday. The waitress nodded promptly with a look of interest. Yes, I remember her. It was almost as quiet as today. She came in and looked around and went right to that table over there. The waitress pointed. Some guy was sitting there. Must have been waiting for her, I guess, anyhow. He ordered fresh coffee for himself and a cup for her, and they began talking. Did this man she met, Nancy interrupted. Can you describe him? Yeah, he was a skinny old guy. He had a mustache and glasses and a hook nose. Oh, and I remember he had a cane. Please go on. Well, next time I looked over that way, the lady had her elbows on the table, and she was holding her head in her hands. She looked real sick. Nancy exchanged a startled glance with Ned, who asked the waitress, Sick enough to need medical attention? She sure looked that way to me. The old guy threw some bills down on the table and they left. She was so wobbly he had to help her walk. Did anyone send for an ambulance? Nancy inquired. No, I could see right out through the glass. A big fat guy with long blonde hair and a beard came up and offered to help. He was holding the lady on one side. I ran out to give the old man his charge and asked if to ask if I could call a doctor." "What did he say?" "He said he was a doctor himself, and he'd take her out for some fresh air." The waitress shrugged. "So they walked out of the building, and that's the last I ever saw of them." How come you're looking for her, dear? Was the lady a relative of yours?" "No, just a friend. But she never returned to her hotel, so it's quite worrisome." The waitress chuckled sympathetically. Nancy thanked her for the information and went back out to the parking lot with Ned. I hate to say this, Nancy, but it sounds like Mrs. Harrod was drugged," Ned commented. "That's just what I'm afraid of. That man she met could easily have slipped something into her coffee." Nancy shaded her eyes as she gazed at the row of parked cars. "Ned." Rose Harrod's car was a silver two-door sedan. I don't know what make, but I'm sure I'll recognize it. Let's see if it's in the lot. After several minutes of searching, Nancy sighed. "Wow, I never realized it before, but silver has got to be the most popular car color." "Let's talk to the parking lot attendant," Ned suggested. "Yes, maybe he'll remember," Nancy said. "Let's just hope he was on duty this time yesterday." The attendant was reading a newspaper in his booth. He was a chubby, about 50 years old, and was a retired policeman. When Nancy asked him about Mrs. Harrod, he immediately recalled seeing the two men bringing her into the lot from the air terminal the day before. "Reason I remember is she drove in here in a nice-looking silver car, and then 10 or 15 minutes later, she came out with two guys having to hold her up on her feet, and then she leaves in their car instead of her own. Course I could see she'd been taken ill, but even so, it kind of seemed odd." "Well, did you talk to them at all?" "Well, when they drove up to pay me, I asked her if everything was okay. At least I tried to. I mean, about leaving her car here and all. She was way too sick and woozy to give me a straight answer. But the old guy with the glasses and the mustache said he was a doctor and he was taking her to the hospital." Nancy said, "Do you remember what kind of car he was driving?" "Yeah, beat up old black station wagon." That seemed funny too, 'cause I figured a doctor would be driving a better car than that, so I even wrote down the license plate number just in case. I got it right here for you. "Good for you!" Nancy jotted down the information, which the parking lot attendant replied, then thanked him and hurried to the nearest public telephone with Ned. Nancy called Chief McGinnis and gave him the description and the license number of the station wagon. She asked if she could trace its registration and have all police cars keep a lookout for it. "Will do, Nancy. I'll call as soon as I have anything," Chief McGinnis promised. After hanging up, Nancy said, "Would you like to come to dinner with me, Ned? There's nothing more we can do for the time being, and I'm sure you must be hungry as I am." "Sounds good to me," Ned replied with a grin. Soon they were on their way to the Drews' house. Hannah Gruen was just about to serve dinner. The motherly housekeeper set another place for Ned, and the two young people joined her and Mr. Drew at the table. Nancy had finished her shrimp cocktail
when the telephone rang. She immediately jumped up, saying, "That may be for me. I'll get it." "Nancy," said the caller's voice when she picked up. "Chief McGinnis here. Sorry if this is your dinner hour, but I thought you'd want to know immediately. The station wagon was reported stolen yesterday. It was found abandoned early this morning, out near Fishwick. Hope this helps you." "Oh, it does, Chief. Thanks for letting me know so promptly." Hanging up, Nancy returned quickly to the dining room. "Ned, they found the station wagon out near Fishwick this morning. I'm going out there now. Want to come?" "Sure thing. Please excuse me, Mrs. Gruen. Mr. Drew." He rose from the table. Nancy hastily apologized for interrupting the meal. "Dad, Hannah, I'll explain when we get back. It's really urgent. I'm sorry." "Please go on with your dinner. We'll get something later on while we're out." Nancy kissed her father and gave Hannah a hug and whirled out of the room, followed by Ned. It was not yet 8 p.m. and still light out. Unfortunately, traffic was sparse, and Nancy drove as fast as the speed limit would allowed down to the river road, then out along the 2-lane country road that led to Fishwick. "I feel like I just can't get there fast enough, Ned," Nancy murmured anxiously. "What do you think happened to her?" "I don't know. Maybe we should have checked the hospitals first." "You're right. If this turns out to be a fruitless trip, that's the next thing we'll do." Fishwick was a seedy beach community strung out along the river banks. It centered on a cafe, a gas station, and general store, and a boating pier. A row of run-down-looking cottages completed the picture. After slowing to look around, Nancy pulled into the gas station. A leathery-faced man got up off his tilted-back chair. "What'll it be, gas or bait?" "Neither." Nancy smiled at him. You look like a very observant man." The man responded with a pleased grin and shrewd wink. "Ain't much goes on around here. Gets by me. Why, you looking for someone?" "Yes, a sick woman. 2 men brought her out here yesterday in an old black station wagon. Did you happen to notice them?" "Yep, that's the place." He pointed to the cottage, half hidden among some trees. Do you know who lives there?" "Shucks. Can't keep track. These places are rented by the day or week." Nancy thanked him and drove on with Ned to the cottage. When they knocked, no one answered, but suddenly a faint moan reached their ears. "Ned, did you hear that?" Nancy exclaimed.
"You bet I did." Her friend put his husky shoulder to the door and pushed hard. Heck yes. The cheap lock soon gave way, and the door flew open. Nancy gasped at the sight that their eyes met. On a bare cot lay Rose Harrod, tied and gagged. Chapter 17. Double Stakeout. Nancy rushed to undo the woman's gag. "Mrs. Harrod!" she exclaimed. "Are you all right?" The woman's eyes flickered open, but they scarcely seemed to focus, and the only audible response was a few faint mumbled words. I don't know. Where am I?" Before Nancy could reply,
Rose Harold's eyes rolled upward and her lids dropped shut again. She was obviously dazed and disordered. She must still be under the effects of that drug the fellow gave her, Ned declared grimly. But Nancy shook her head. I doubt if whatever he slipped her in her coffee would keep her under this long. More likely they sedated her again after they brought her in the cottage. The cottage, though, was barely furnished, at least had electricity and running water. Ned switched on the overhead light, since dusk was gathering fast outside, and untied the ropes binding Mrs. Harrod. Meanwhile, Nancy wrung out her handkerchief in cold water. Together they raised Mrs. Harrod to a sitting position and managed to revive her, but she was able to stammer out only a few confused words about the kidnapping before slumping unconscious again. We'd better get her to a doctor right away, Ned decided. Yes, the sooner the better, Nancy agreed. I'll help you carry her out to the car. No problem. I can carry her. Ned, a well-muscled 6-footer, easily gathered the woman up in his arms, and minutes later they were speeding back to town. After they had delivered Mrs. Harrod to the emergency room of the River Heights Hospital, Nancy called police headquarters to report what had happened. By the time she hung up, the intern on duty had finished examining the patient. She's been drugged all right, he told Nancy and Ned, but I don't think there'll be any permanent ill effects. In any case, I want to keep her here under observation, at least overnight. The two young people went to a nearby restaurant to settle down, at last to their delayed dinner. But both were still too keyed up over the events of the evening to eat much. Moreover, Nancy was already laying plans for her night's detective work. Will you help me, Ned? She asked. When he eagerly agreed, Nancy explained what she had in mind. Then she made several calls from a payphone in the restroom. She succeeded in contacting reporter Rick Jason, George Fane's friend Neil Sawyer, the electrical engineering student, and the park policeman Officer Doyle, who by now had gone off duty. All three promised to meet her shortly before 11 p.m. at the same wooded stakeout spot where she and Ned had kept watch on the carousel on Monday night. It was long past 9:30 when Nancy and Ned finally left the restaurant. They drove first to police headquarters, where Nancy borrowed a pair of police walkie-talkie radios. Then they drove onto the Trent's house. Nancy had already called Joy from the restaurant and learned that she had a key to the daycare center, since Joy did volunteer work there in addition to lending her carousel horse for the children's enjoyment. Ned waited in the car while Nancy went up to ring the bell. Joy herself answered the door and handed Nancy the key. Something tells me you have an exciting evening ahead, she said enviously. The young sleuth chuckled and held up crossed fingers. I just hope it doesn't get too exciting. For my health. After leaving Joy's house, Nancy and Ned headed for the daycare center. They parked well out of sight of their destination and walked the rest of the way. At this late hour, the whole surrounding neighborhood lay dark and silent. The only sounds were the occasional faint echo of traffic from Riverside Avenue, which bordered the park, several blocks away. Nancy and Ned found a shadowy spot among the tall pines and hemlocks and bushes from which they could keep watch unseen on the big old house. During dinner time, they had found time to glance at the photo history on the center's carousel horse, which had appeared in the evening paper. You think that'll be enough to attract the same burglars who broke into Joy Trent's house? Ned inquired softly. That or the television news bit, I hope, Nancy replied, assuming my hunch is right, of course. As the hands of her rich boss crept around toward 11 o'clock, Nancy finally left Ned to keep watch alone, while she went to check with her three cohorts outside of the amusement park. Rick Jason, Neil Sawyer, and Officer Doyle were all waiting at the agreed-upon spot just outside the park's pipe and chain barrier as Nancy came walking along the dark footpath to join them. Rick Jason was in high spirits at the prospect of a possible news scoop. So, this is how the famous girl detective gets her man, huh? He bantered. Nancy Drew's blue eyes twinkled in the moonlight. That remains to be seen. Minutes later, the midway lights were turned off and the amusement park area gradually settled down to stillness and dark. At last, Neil Sawyer legged over the pipe chain barrier and made his way cautiously toward the carousel. When he returned, he was grinning broadly. Did my ploy work? Nancy inquired. You bet. There's a radio relay switch attached to the control box, just like I described to you. He reported with a triumphant look. Marvelous. Nancy grinned back. George certainly recommended the right technician expert. After a hasty final discussion with Neil, Rick, and Officer Doyle, Nancy left the park and returned to Ned at their spy post outside the daycare center. Any developments, Ned? Nothing so far. I just wish we'd brought something comfortable to sit on, Nancy giggled. Never mind. At least there's enough grass and undergrowth to keep the pine needles from pricking us. She leaned against her friend's shoulder, and Ned slipped his arm around her waist. 20 minutes went by pleasantly as they chatted under their breath and enjoyed each other's company. There was a sudden crackle of static, and Officer Doyle's voice came over Nancy's walkie-talkie. The trap has been sprung. Chapter 18. Circling Shadows. So her plan had succeeded. Nancy smiled triumphantly at a grinning Ned. Nice going, beautiful, he commented, patting his arm.
Nancy murmured. I'll be back as soon as I can. Take care. With that, she hurried off to her car and drove a few blocks to the amusement park, which was now particularly lit up. Grouped around the carousel were Officer Doyle, Richard Jason, Neil Sawyer, and a nervous-looking Leo Novak. Smart girl, Nancy. Richard Jason greeted her with a grin. Everything happened just as you predicted. The carousel suddenly started playing, and that woke up the people in the trailers, and the lights came on. Then Mr. Novak came running up to the carousel. Officer Doyle chimed in. It stopped playing when he was halfway to it, but he checked over the machinery. The teenage sleuth turned to Leo Novak and asked, What did you find? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The carousel owner blurted out emphatically. He plowed his fingers through his dark hair with bewilderment expressionless on his face. I have no idea what's causing all of this funny business, and I don't see any sign of the operating machinery being tampered with. Nancy, Rick, and Officer Doyle glanced at one another. Meanwhile, Neil Sawyer quietly went over and slipped his hand under the operator's control box. Mr. Novak's right, he reported. A moment later, there were no gimmicks on the controls now. In this way, he let the others know that someone had removed the radio delay he had discovered earlier that evening. Nancy nodded and flashed a barely perceptible eye signal to Officer Doyle. The policeman immediately turned to Leo Novak. I wonder if you'd be good enough to empty your pockets, sir. What? Leo Novak stared indignantly. It's up to you, Mr. Novak. Empty your pockets now, voluntarily, or I intend to arrest you for disturbing the peace. Disturbing the peace? The owner's face was rapidly taking on a deep crimson of flush. That's right, Officer Doyle explained calmly. By running your carousel after hours, that'll mean a trip to the station and everything else that goes with being arrested. Now wait a minute, Leon Novak began angrily. But after one look at the faces of the surrounding witnesses, he dropped his bluff and Sully emptied his pockets. Among the sparse contents which he dumped into Officer Doyle's waiting hands was a little metal and a plastic device with a short length of wire and a spring clip attached to each end. There's the radio delay, said Neil Sawyer. Next, something that looked like a small handheld walkie-talkie with a disappearing antenna emerged from the owner's pocket. And there's the signal transmitter, Neil added. Novak's face was livid with fury, but he knew he was trapped. Nancy turned to Rick Jason. Well, I have solved the mystery of the haunted carousel. Have I solved the mystery of the haunted carousel, or not? Before the reporter could do more than nod, the borrowed walkie-talkie attached to Officer Doyle's belt suddenly came to life. Ned's voice, low but quivering with suppressed excitement, crackled from the speaker. Nancy, come back here, fast, and try to avoid being seen. Leaving the policeman to deal with Leo Novak, Nancy was, with a hasty wave of her hand, turned
and ran back to her car in the parking lot. In a few moments, she was driving through the dark, sleeping streets toward the daycare center, again parking a block or so away. She slipped out of the car and walked swiftly to Ned's hiding place among the trees and shrubbery. As she joined him, he whispered, "I saw a car drive slowly around the block 3 times, then stop around the corner of the site. Did anyone get out?" Nancy inquired softly. "Yes, I heard the car door open and shut, and I think someone's trying to get in the house right now, by the back way." As the young people strained their eyes to pierce the midnight gloom, a flickering light suddenly appeared, first in one window, then another. Someone was moving through the big old house. "What now?" Ned said tensely. "Want me to go in there after them? We'll both go. But not yet. First, we better make sure they didn't post an outlook." Slipping through the trees as silently as shadows, the pair circled the grounds of the daycare center and made their way cautiously toward the Marauder's car. It was empty. Nancy drew a sigh of relief. Very funny. Okay, no lookout. Now to see what they're up to inside. Wait a minute. Ned seized her arm. "Let me go in there alone. You wait out here." Nancy pressed her lips to his cheek. "Don't be silly. We'll be safer if we stay together." Before Ned could object further, Nancy darted back toward the house. Her friend followed hastily. Hand in hand, they tiptoed up the broad front porch steps. Nancy reached in her pocket and took out the key Joy Trent had given her. She inserted it in the lock, turned it, and cautiously pushed open the big front door. It swung inward with faintly creaking hinges. Inside, all was dark. Nancy and Ned held their breath for a moment to make sure no one had heard the creaks. Then they slipped into the house and inched the door shut behind them. Having visited the daycare center many hours earlier, Nancy fortunately was able to lead the way. Groping for obstacles in the darkness, they crossed a tiled vestibule, then went down a central hall and veered off through 2 carpeted rooms toward what was now the nursery playroom. Here they paused and, with bated breath, maneuvered themselves into suitable positions from which to peek into the lighted room. 2 men were standing near Joy's carousel horse. One was thin, scar-faced, elderly fellow in a dark business suit with glasses, mustache, and a large hooked nose. The other, who looked like an overage hippie, was big and fat with long blonde hair and beard. They appeared to be tampering with the saddle pad of the wooden horse, trying to pry it up, first on one side and then on the other, but without success. You sure you got the instructions right?" The bigger man growled at his partner. "Read the letter again." The elderly, scar-faced man took a folded paper out of his pocket and started to read it aloud, muttering voice. Nancy, much to her vexation, was unable to catch most of the words. Meanwhile, Ned was leaning on the back of a chair. While he crammed to peer around the edge, way to go, Ned, of the archway into the playroom, suddenly he felt his fingers slipping. He struggled desperately to keep his grip and his balance, but it was no use. A moment later, the chair slipped out from under him, and Ned went crashing to the floor. With a snarl and an oath, the two intruders realized they were being spied on. They rushed at Ned and Nancy. The elderly mustache man grabbed Nancy by the shoulder. He pushed her back against the wall, pinning her tightly. Before Ned could scramble to his feet to help her, the burly hippie booted him down with a hard, vicious kick. Chapter 19. A Precious Parcel. Ned grabbed the crook's foot to keep from being kicked again. He tried to twist his ankle and topple him at the same time. The crook started to fall, but managed to clutch onto the chair that Ned had overturned. He swung it sideways with both hands, grazing Ned's shoulder and arm. Out of the corner of her eye, Nancy saw her boyfriend wince with pain and let go his grip on his enemy's foot. At the same time, Nancy saw the distraction in her captor's eye. His grip loosened, and she shoved him backwards. She bolted forward, snatching up one of the small child-sized chairs in the playroom, and began to swing it at her mustached assault. With an angry oath, he backed away, although Nancy kept him at bay. She soon found she was being expertly maneuvered into a corner. She caught a fleeting glimpse of Ned. By now, he had regained his feet and was fighting back gamely against his burly foe. But he was using only one arm, and with a sinking heart, Nancy realized it was only a matter of time before they might both find themselves at the mercy of their ruthless attackers. Suddenly, a third man rushed into the room. At first, Nancy took it for granted that he must be an ally or a partner of the other two crooks. Her hasty glance at the dim-lighted registered only the fact that he was a stocky and gray-haired and wore a clay-colored safari jacket. No. She tried not to panic at the thought that this is additional help for their enemies. She and Ned would not now probably be overpowered in short order. Instead of Nancy's astonishment, the newcomer grabbed one of her assailant and twisted it behind his back. As he bent forward, trying to wrench himself away, Nancy knocked him to the floor with a blow from the chair which she had been using as a shield. The crook groaned and went limp, too stunned to resist further. Without a word, Nancy and her rescuer turned to help Ned. His attacker grunted and gulped as the gray-haired man grabbed him around the neck. Ned seized his chance to plant his fist into the big crook's stomach. Yes! Then, as the fellow crumbled, Ned laid him a hard punch on his jaw. With a cry of relief, Nancy hugged her friend. "Oh, Ned! Thank goodness!" was all she could say for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked anxiously. Nancy smiled at him. "I will be when I catch my breath." Nancy had already deduced the identities of the two attackers, partly from their voices. Their present appearances confirmed her guess. The burly hippie had lost his blonde wig, and his fake beard was hanging loose. Nancy easily recognized him as Bardley Krebs. As a result of the frantic struggle, his companion's mustache and putty nose were both crooked, and the reddish fake scar had rubbed off his cheek when he fell on the floor. No wonder Bess didn't recognize him as Fingers Malone after I chased him in the park that day, thought Nancy. He probably put on his disguise before he came out of the haunted house. Meanwhile, Ned was shaking hands with the gray-haired man in the safari jacket. Nancy, too, started to thank him, then broke off with a gasp as she got her first look at their rescuer. "Why, Mr. Franz! What are you doing here?" "Yes, I thought that was him." And that's why I was like, no, he can't be one of the bad guys. He's one of the good guys. Yes, yes. She blurted out as she recognized the retired businessman and amusement park buff. "Yay! Luckily you left your key in the door just now," Franz chuckled, turning serious, and added, "I must apologize for deceiving you, Miss Drew. Actually, I'm an insurance investigator, and I liked you better when you were an amusement park buff." Well, anyway, tell me about what you do. "And I've been trailing these crooks forever." "Fun." "Since Finger Malone broke out of prison." "An insurance company after a crook for a prison break?" Ned looked puzzled. "I don't get it." It wasn't the prison break that brought him here," Nancy deduced. "I'll bet you're looking for something Fingers stole 20 years ago. Right, Mr. Franz?" It was the insurance investigator's turn to look startled. "Absolutely right, Miss Drew. But how did you know?" "Because I learned his background from the St. Louis Police Department, who's also in town looking for him." "Dang. If you guys had all teamed up, this probably would have gotten resolved a lot sooner." Arno Franz explained that he had seen and heard the news stories about the carousel horse at the daycare center, and like Nancy had suspected this might prove an irresistible bait to the criminal he was after. Accordingly, he had come to the daycare center late at night, arriving just before Nancy and Ned had entered the big old house. Franz eyed the wooden steed in perplexity. "You know, I have a strong hunch that what I'm looking for may be hidden inside this thing," he mused aloud. "But don't ask me exactly how or where." Nancy smiled mysteriously. "I'll try to answer that question tomorrow, when everyone can be here," she said, "especially Joy Trent, who owns this carousel horse. In the meantime, I think we'd better let Police Chief McGinnis and Detective Norris know about these two. I'll go and phone them from the office in the next room." A police cruiser soon arrived outside the house, and 2 crooks were whisked off in handcuffs. Nancy was praised and congratulated for the clever way in which for the clever way in which she had brought the manhunt to a successful conclusion. But the complete solution of the case still remained unknown. When Nancy walked into the playroom at the daycare center at 11 o'clock the following morning, accompanied by Bess and George, she found an expectant group of people seated and eagerly waiting for revolutions. Among them were Alonzo Franz, Police Chief McGinnis, reporter Rick Jason, Detective Norris, and a smiling Joy Trent and her haughty Aunt Selma. Bess and George found their chairs next to Ned, who had arrived a few minutes later in his own car. You felt the need to elaborate that, huh? I'm dying of curiosity, Nancy, Bess whispered to her friend. Hurry up and start explaining. Nancy smiled and cleared her throat. We've had a number of mysterious happenings in River Heights recently, but one way or another we all have to do with this carousel horse of Joy's, which incidentally happens to be extremely valuable. Joy Trent shot a quizzical glance at the young detective. Glory certainly means a lot to me, Nancy, she said. But you mean he's valuable for some other reason, too? Very much so. He was carved by a famous Western artist named Walter Cruz. And the director of the River Heights Art Museum estimates your horse may be worth a great deal. Thousands of dollars, in fact. Joy's eyes widened, and the audience gasped at Nancy's announcement. The teenage detective explained that horses had been one of Cruz's favorite subjects, both as a painter and a sculptor, and that he had easily identified his style after consulting the library book that contained pictures of his, she had easily identified his style after consulting the library book that contained pictures of his work. Okay, there we go. When Cruz carved this horse, Nancy went on, he was an unknown artist. At the time, he was working as a carny rouseabout, still need to look that up, at the same amusement park in St. Louis where the Wonder Gallop was located. There we go. The lead horse on the carousel was damaged by a truck. So as a favor to his girlfriend's father, who then owned the merry-go-round, Walter Cruz carved a replacement horse. No wonder it's so beautiful, Bess murmured. Nancy related that Leo Novak was only an employee of the owner, Mr. Ogden, when the horse was carved. Later, Ogden moved the carousel to River Heights, but after several years, he took it back to the same park in St. Louis. On Ogden's death, Novak took over the Wonderland Gallop. Then last winter, Nancy went on, Novak read a newspaper story about the late artist Walter Cruz and how his work was now bringing record prices in New York art galleries. He suddenly realized that this was the same Walter Cruz who had carved the replacement horse for the carousel, which Ogden had sold to Joy's father, and if he could get it back, it might be worth a small fortune. Unfortunately for Novak, however, he had been unable to recall the name of the little girl or her father. So he devised a clever plan and moved the carousel back to River Heights by playing the carousel spookily at night, said Nancy. Novak gained a lot of free publicity for the Wonderland Gallop, which, of course, also helped make it a popular attraction at the amusement park. But his real purpose was to make sure Joy heard that the carousel had returned to River Heights. He was hoping that the news might draw her out to the park for a nostalgic visit. If so, he was sure he would recognize her by her flaming red hair and different color eyes, especially since she still had the photograph of especially since he still had the photograph of her as a little girl that Mr. Trent had presented to Ogden at the time. It's still stuck up on the wall of the trailer that Novak took over when he bought the carousel. Finger Malone and Baldly Krebs, however, spoiled Novak's plan. They too were after the horse, which Cruz had carved for a different reason. They were the two dark figures seen by Ned and Nancy the night they kept watch in the park. After failing to find what they were looking for that night, they realized that a new lead horse had been mounted on the merry-go-round. So they came to Leo's trailer later on that same night and scared the truths out of him. He knew the two wanted criminals were highly dangerous, so he told them the whole story of how the horse had been brought to Joy's father. But the next day, Nancy went on, when they saw Detective Norris from St. Louis hunting them at the park, they jumped to a conclusion that Novak had betrayed them to the police. So they beat him up as a warning and gave him a black eye. Oh, okay. When Joy came to the park, they trailed her home and returned that night to break into the Trent house, but failed to find the horse. Novak, guessing what they would do, had vengefully tipped off the police. But Fingers and Baldy managed to escape capture. If you'll excuse me for interrupting, Nancy, Jason cut in, you still haven't told us why those two crooks, Fingers and Malone and Baldy Krebs, were after Joy's horse. Nancy smiled. I was just coming to that. The reason goes back 20 years to a time when Fingers was first being hunted by the law. He was hiding out in the same St. Louis amusement park where the Wonderland Gallop was situated, working as a carny. But he couldn't resist picking pockets. He even persuaded one of the young park employees to help him on occasion. Detective Norris says he was arrested the other day. The St. Lucia officer nodded, then told the history of Fingers Malone, beginning with a prominent local jeweler who had been robbed at the park. The loot was a small parcel of diamonds, which he had just received from New York that afternoon. Fingers Malone was nabbed soon afterward, but the diamonds were never recovered. In fact, said Nancy, the assurance company that Mr. Arno Fons works for has been trying to trace those diamonds ever since. Do you know what happened to them? Rick Jason inquired keenly. Nancy smiled and nodded. I think so. Fingers knew he might soon be arrested, so he entrusted the diamonds to his friend, Walt Cruz. You mean the famous artist helped this pickpocket hide his loot? Remember, Cruz wasn't a famous artist yet at the time, Nancy pointed out. As a matter of fact, he was quite a rough and ready, happy-go-lucky type. An ex-cowboy and a cattle rustler who didn't have a hoot for the law. Mind you, I'm not saying he knew the parcel Fingers gave him contained stolen jewels. He simply didn't ask many questions and agreed to keep the jewels. Soon after, Nancy continued, an art dealer saw some of Cruz's work and invited him to come to New York and pursue his career. As an impish joke, Cruz decided to hide the diamonds inside the carousel horse, which he had just about finished carving for his girlfriend's father. By then, Fingers had been arrested and placed on trial. Cruz, however, managed to get word to him through a confidential letter smuggled to him in the courtroom by a friend. As a result, Nancy concluded, Fingers went looking for the loot, and when he broke out of prison 20 years later, and I've been trailing him ever since, said Arno Franz. But if Fingers received Cruz's letter, why couldn't he and Baldy find the diamonds in the horse last night? Because, Nancy replied with a twinkling glance at Joy, they didn't know that Joy Trent had already found the diamonds when he remounted the horse on the stand of his own design. What? Joy looked astonished. But, Nancy, Daddy never said a word to me about finding any such thing. No, I think he kept them as a surprise for you, Joy, along with another surprise. Chapter 20. Picture Story. Another surprise? Joy gave Nancy a bewildered stare and giggled nervously. I'd say there've been enough surprises already, too. Oh, wait! She broke off eagerly. Does this one have something to do with the drawing we found tucked in the statuette in Daddy's study? Good guess, Joy. Do you have it with you? Oh, yes, of course! With trembling fingers, Joy fished the crumpled up piece of tissue paper out of her bag and handed it to the teenage sleuth. Nancy showed the drawing to her audience, all of whom were watching and listening with intense fascination as she unraveled the tangled mystery. As you can see, it's a drawing of a frog on a horse. For a long time, I couldn't imagine what it meant, until I suddenly realized that there is a frog on every horse. In fact, 4 of them. 4 frogs on every horse? Police Chief McGinnis scratched his bald head. You'll have to explain that to the rest of us who aren't expert riders like you are, Nancy. Nancy grinned back and explained. The tough, spongy part in the center of a horse's foot, the part enclosed by the hard hoof, is called a sponge. So like the sole of the hoof is called a frog. Is called the frog. Got it. Okay. Nancy gestured toward the carousel horse. Since Glory is a lead horse, rather than a jumper, he has 3 feet on the ground and only 1 upraised. So I'm sure that Mr. Trent's sketch of a frog on a horse was intended to draw Joy's attention to this one particular foot. Nancy's brow puckered slightly. In Glory's case, of course, his whole foot and leg are made of wood, so... No, wait a minute! An excited look came over Nancy's face as she pressed hard on the bottom of the horse's upraised hoof. The frog on this foot is not wood. It feels more like hard rubber. She broke off long enough to get a nail file from her shoulder bag, then returned to the examination of Glory's foot. The glossy paint made it appear that the horseshoe hoof and the frog were all made of wood, but then Nancy ran the point of the nail file around the inside curve of the horseshoe and began to gouge and pry as deeply as she could. It gradually became apparent that the frog had been crafted separately from the rest of the foot. At last, after minutes of effort succeeding in pulling the frog out of the rest of Glory's foot like a cork out of a bottle, Joy gasped in excitement. His foot's hollow! Right! Nancy probed inside with her fingers and extracted a tightly rolled brown paper package. When unrolled, it proved to contain a handful of small glittering gems wrapped in several sheets of letter paper that bore a man's handwriting. These stones, Nancy went on, turning over to Police Chief McGinnis and Arno Frez, are, of course, the diamonds that Fingers Malone stole at the park in St. Louis 20 years ago. And these sheets of paper are a letter to Joy from her father. Silence settled over the room as Joy read the letter. Her eyes were misting as she handed the sheets to Nancy one by one. The first page began. Dear Joy, this is the hardest letter I have ever had to write. For years I could never decide whether or not to tell you the truth about your mother and the unhappy early days of our marriage. Now I have decided to leave it up to fate. I have devised a riddle involving your mother's name, Iris. If you are interested enough and really determined to solve the riddle in order to find out more about her, you may eventually discover this letter. If not, perhaps it is just as well that you never learn the sad truth about our past. As I say, I leave the outcome to fate. After reading the entire letter, Nancy turned to Joy. Shall I tell the others what your father says? Nancy, the red-headed Harris blinked and nodded, unable to speak because of the tearful emotion. Nancy explained to the others that John Trent's wife, Iris, had come from a wealthy family in the Midwest who strongly opposed her marriage to a poor working-class mechanist from a blue-collar background. Nevertheless, the two were so deeply in love that Iris had eloped with him. As a result, she became estranged from her parents. At first, the two newlyweds were very happy, Nancy went on, but after their baby was born, Iris became gravely ill. The one chance to save her life was by an expensive operation that would cost thousands of dollars. Far more than John Trent could raise or borrow. So reluctantly, he was forced to turn to her parents for help. They agreed to pay for her medical care, but only if he promised to get out of her life for forever. That shows you what mean, hard-hearted people they were. Joy's aunt Selma blurted out angrily. It seems so to us now, Nancy said with a sigh, but no doubt they too were very unhappy over their daughter's plight. Anyhow, they throw anyhow around in this book like it's an LOL. John finally and sadly agreed to their demands. But when he left, he took the baby with him and covered his tracks by changing his name from Tobin to Trent. Later, his letter said he learned that his wife had undergone a series of delicate operations which saved her life but left her a permanent invalid. Invalid. During her few remaining months, she had to be kept on a life support system. So that he was never able to communicate with her, even secretly. From that time on, Nancy ended. John Trent suffered bitterly from feelings of guilt, wondering if he had done the right thing. Joy, who was deeply moved by the last learning about her mother, murmured, "Oh, how could I wish I could have known her. I don't even have a picture of her." Nancy smiled at the girl. "Perhaps not. But you do have someone who looks very much like her." Again, Joy stared at the teenage sleuth. I don't understand. What do you mean?" Instead of replying, Nancy opened the door and beckoned to someone waiting outside. An attractive woman with dark reddish-brown hair walked into the room. "This is Mrs. Rose Harold," Nancy announced to the wide-eyed girl. "Your mother's twin sister." Is that why they both have flower names? 'Cause theming? Joy uttered a cry of astonishment. Mrs. Harrod, who by now had completely recovered from her kidnapping ordeal, came toward her smiling and with outstretched arms and gathered her into a fond embrace. "Oh, Joy, dear, I've been trying so hard to find you." It was a highly emotional moment. Both Rose, Harold, and Joy were soon weeping tears of happiness. Rose then filled in the missing parts of the story. She too, like her sister Iris, had become estranged from her harsh aristocratic parents, and because they disapproved of her marriage, Rose's husband, then a sergeant, now a major in the U.S. Marine Corps, was currently on sea duty. But 7 or 8 years ago, while he was stationed in Japan, a friend had sent Rose a magazine clipping in full color with a scribbled notion. Doesn't this little girl look just like you did at Doesn't this little girl look just like you did at her age? The picture, which seemed to have been clipped from some industrial publication or trade journal, showed an unnamed business executive buying a carousel horse for his little daughter. It wasn't until much later, Rose Harold told Joy, that I realized the little girl in the picture must be Iris's child. You see, I was out of touch with my parents and somehow lost touch with your mother, so I never learned the full story of your mother's marriage or how she came to be separated from your father. After Rose's parents died, however, she did learn the full story and decided to trace Iris's lost daughter. Unfortunately, the clipping included no caption, and she was unable to find out what magazine it came from. Then I read in the paper about the haunted carousel, Rose went on. I saw the name on it and the Wonder Gallop, and I suddenly realized it was the same merry-go-round shown in the clipping. Accordingly, Rose had come to River Heights and talked to Leon Novak. Novak, prompt by his own greed and suspicious nature, had jumped to a conclusion that she was really after the valuable horse carved by Walter Cruz. So he deliberately misled her, pretending he had no connection with the carousel at the time the picture was taken. Instead, he had turned over her name and address to Fingers and Bailey. They had kidnapped Mrs. Herod, hoping to extort any clues she might have to the whereabouts of the missing carousel horse. Before this happened, however, Rose had gone to River Heights Chamber of Commerce and showed them the magazine clipping. They had immediately recognized the man in the picture as the late local machine tool tycoon John Trent. After thus finally tracing her dead sister's spouse, Rose had gone to the Trent house trying to meet Joy, only to be painfully rebuffed by Mrs. Yawley. She had turned to Nancy for help. But I did so very cautiously, as you know, Nancy, Rose Harold added with a rueful smile. I wasn't sure whose side you might be on. The real choice, I believe, said a man's voice, now lies with Miss Joy Trent herself. All eyes turned to the speaker, a white-haired man who had entered the room quietly behind Mrs. Herod. He was John Trent's lawyer. What exactly do you mean, Mr. Trimble? Joy asked him. I mean, my dear, do you prefer to place yourself under the care of your father's sister, Mrs. Selma Yonley, or your mother's sister, Mrs. Rose Herod? Now just a minute, Mrs. Yawley cut in shrilly. This child is not mature enough to make such a decision herself. Let me remind you that John's will names me as Joy's guardian. Only temporarily and conditionally, madam, the attorney corrected her. It so happens my late client, John Trent, left a codicil to his will, which you have never seen. As he spoke, Mr. Trimble extracted a paper from his briefcase and handed it to Mrs. Yawley. As you will see there, he went on, Mr. Trent realized that you and Joy might not get along well. He also foresaw that if Joy solved the riddle which he left her, she might eventually meet her mother's twin sister. He therefore added the codicil stating that if this happened, Joy could decide for herself whether you or her other aunt should be her guardian until she comes of age. With a glad cry, Joy rushed into Rose Hardin's embrace. Brilliant flashes blazed in the playroom as reporter Rick Jason raised his camera and began snapping photos. Yeah, dude. Yeah, same. For a fleeting moment, Nancy wondered if her next mystery would be as exciting as this one. She would know very soon when she accepted the challenge of the enemy match. Ooh, fun. Her blue eyes twinkled as she whispered to Ned, those two crooks, Finger and Baldy, will still have to stand trial, but I think one case, at least, has been settled out of court. True that, Nancy. And that brings us to the conclusion of the Haunted Carousel. I would be remiss if I didn't end off this video talking a little bit about some of the differences between this book and the video game that inspired me to read this book. So the Haunted Carousel game, first off the bat, it is completely different narrative-wise from this. It focuses a lot more on the idea of a haunted carousel and expands upon that. It expands more on like what the inner workings of a carousel actually look like and stuff like that, and it expands upon the idea of like carving carousel horses a lot more, and a lot of the stuff that is just like dialogue in here you actually like read in books in the game and such. And I'm not sponsored by Her Interactive, although they've been like shoving their ads down my throat on YouTube lately. It's like anytime I get an ad on YouTube, it's Her Interactive. But I will say Haunted Carousel is like my favorite of the Nancy Drew Her Interactive games. And the book, it definitely is a little bit darker than the original game. The game definitely took a lot of elements from the book, but kept it overall a light-hearted, happy mood, and updated a lot of the ideas for a modern audience. And also it combined a lot of characters, a lot of plot elements to make it more easy to animate, because this book probably has like 10 or 12 characters, but in the game they combined a lot of those characters, so it's just like 4 suspects and a lot of like phone contacts, but it's only like 4 like animated, only 4 characters they had to animate. But anyway, the main difference between the book and the game is the game keeps it relatively happy-go-lucky. Yes, the parents are dead, but we get that reassurance that they loved each other, they loved their kid, that stuff. There isn't any of the guardian stuff in the game. Partially, I think, because they were updating it, and also because I think in the game Joy is more of an adult. In the book she's more of a kid, but in the game she's definitely like, at least if I had to guess, like I would say mid-20s, maybe early 30s, because she seems to be off on her own as far as we know. She's
like got her job. She probably has her own house. But yeah, so that's just a few little differences between the book and the game. So yeah, I enjoyed this, even though it was a little bit darker than the game itself, but I had fun reading it. It really kept my attention, as you can probably tell, since how these were all recorded in succession. And it's like past midnight now, so I'm going to stop that for now. But that was some great progress for today. I don't know how many books we're down to at this point, but yeah, hopefully I can reach my goal of reading 17 books by Halloween. Hopefully. I don't know. I've only got like 2 days left. I may be screwed, but I'm gonna shut up.